Have you ever believed something for so long that it stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like truth? Not because you examined it carefully, but because everyone around you repeated it in the same calm, confident tone. For decades, there has been a quiet assumption carried across borders and conversations, one that rarely sounds cruel, yet carries a deep injustice inside it. Filipinos are kind, people say, but only when life is easy, only in familiar places, only at home. Under pressure, under fear, under political tension, that kindness would surely fade. It is spoken softly, almost politely, as if the world has already agreed and moved on. That belief appears in unexpected places, in academic halls, in humanitarian briefings, in diplomatic circles where people speak of nations as statistics rather than souls. It becomes background noise, unquestioned and unchallenged. Even respected professionals repeat it, not out of malice, but out of habit. And when an idea is repeated long enough, it begins to feel inevitable. Then comes the moment that breaks it. Not with drama, not with headlines, but with silence. In the heart of Tehran, a city known globally for resilience, tension, and endurance, a small scene unfolded inside a hospital that forced one man to question everything he thought he understood about kindness. The hospital corridors were narrow, the air heavy with exhaustion. Outside, the city carried its familiar weight of uncertainty. Inside, people moved carefully, conserving energy, conserving hope. The man watching was named Daniel. In his late 50s, Daniel had spent most of his adult life moving between crisis zones. He was an international humanitarian evaluator, trained to analyze systems, identify failures, and recommend reforms. He had worked in refugee camps where hope ran thin, in hospitals where resources were scarce, and in countries where compassion had been worn down by years of conflict. He believed in efficiency, in structure, in plans that could be measured and improved. Kindness, in his experience, was real but unreliable. Something human, something fragile. Daniel had arrived in Tehran expecting to confirm what he already knew. Sanctions strained medical supplies. Political pressure drained morale. People did their jobs, but with guarded hearts. What he did not expect was to keep noticing the same quiet detail again and again. The calm voices in stressful moments often belonged to Filipinos. The nurses who stayed past their shifts were Filipinos. The caregivers who translated patiently, who smiled without being asked, who treated fear as gently as illness, were Filipinos. At first, he dismissed it. Professional discipline, he thought. Cultural politeness. Nothing more. Until one evening, when an elderly Iranian patient grew restless and afraid. The room felt tight with tension. Machines beeped steadily. A Filipino nurse knelt beside the bed. She did not rush. She did not speak loudly. She held the man's hand and whispered a prayer, first in English, then softly again, as if the meaning mattered more than the language. There was no audience, no instruction, no benefit to her beyond the moment itself. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not because of what she did, but because of what it revealed. This was not kindness as performance. This was kindness as instinct. From that moment on, he could no longer unsee what was happening around him. Filipinos sharing food with co-workers who had once been strangers. Filipinos checking on patients during breaks. Filipinos speaking about their families back in the Philippines with longing, faith, and an absence of bitterness. Many sent most of their earnings home. Many lived simply, yet none carried resentment in their posture. Something inside Daniel shifted, slowly and uncomfortably. The belief he had carried for years no longer fit the reality in front of him. If kindness could survive here, in a place shaped by pressure and uncertainty, then perhaps the world had misunderstood something fundamental. Perhaps it had underestimated an entire people. As Daniel walked through the streets of Tehran that night, listening to distant city sounds and watching lights flicker in apartment windows, one question followed him with growing weight. Where does this kind of strength come from? As the days passed, Daniel tried to return to his routine, to his checklists and evaluations, but the questions followed him everywhere. They sat with him during morning briefings, hovered in the silence of hospital elevators, and returned late at night when the city outside softened into shadows. He told himself not to romanticize what he was seeing. He had done this work too long to be fooled by moments. Systems mattered, not impressions. And yet, the more he observed, the more uncomfortable his certainty became. Daniel's life before Tehran had been shaped by loss and fatigue, though he rarely spoke of it. Years earlier, he had watched healthcare systems collapse under the weight of bureaucracy in places that claimed to be advanced. He had seen children turned away because paperwork was incomplete, elderly patients treated as logistical problems rather than people. In some countries, the technology was flawless, but the warmth was gone. In others, ideology replaced compassion. Over time, Daniel learned to protect himself by lowering his expectations. Hope, he believed, was inefficient, dangerous even. He had carried that mindset across continents. In the United States, he saw hospitals that functioned like factories. In parts of Europe, he saw care delivered with precision but little soul. In Asia, discipline masked exhaustion. Everywhere people were doing their jobs, but something essential felt absent. By the time he arrived in Tehran, Daniel was prepared to witness more of the same, intensified by sanctions and political strain. Instead, frustration crept in from a different direction. He kept encountering Filipinos in roles that required emotional endurance, not just technical skill. Night shifts, high-risk wards, positions where patience mattered more than speed. He noticed how often they absorbed tension so others did not have to. When tempers flared, they softened the room. When fear rose, they steadied it. One evening, Daniel joined a small group of healthcare workers for a late meal in a modest apartment. The space was simple. Thin walls, second-hand furniture, no complaints. The conversation moved easily from work to family, from exhaustion to faith. They spoke of parents aging back in the Philippines, of children growing up with video calls instead of embraces. There was sadness there, but it was carried gently, like something sacred rather than bitter. Daniel asked why they stayed in such a difficult place when they could try for easier contracts elsewhere. One nurse smiled, not sadly, but calmly. She said, "People here need us, and we are used to hardship. We bring what we have." That answer unsettled him more than any tragic statistic ever had. He thought of his own journey, of how often he had left places the moment the burden became too heavy. He thought of colleagues who burned out and withdrew. And here were people who leaned in instead. Still, Daniel resisted drawing conclusions. He told himself this was only one community, one pocket of goodness. He had seen kindness fade before. He expected it to crack under pressure. Then a week of heightened tension arrived. Supplies ran low. Shifts grew longer. Anxiety filled the hospital. Daniel watched closely, waiting for the change. It did not come. Instead, he saw Filipinos organizing quietly, covering for one another, sharing food, praying together in brief moments stolen between responsibilities. They did not deny the hardship. They accepted it. There was no drama in their resilience, only steadiness. Late one night, Daniel found himself alone in the corridor where he had first witnessed that whispered prayer. He stood there longer than necessary, feeling the weight of his own assumptions. For the first time in years, despair did not feel inevitable. Something else was forming beneath it, fragile but real. He did not yet have the words for it. He only knew that whatever he was witnessing here did not begin in Tehran. It had traveled a long way to reach this place. And the longer Daniel stayed, the more he wondered if the source of that strength lay somewhere he had never truly considered. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. For Daniel, it began with a name repeated often enough to gain weight: the Philippines. It surfaced in conversations the way a memory does, gently, without insistence. A nurse spoke of her training in Manila as if she were speaking of a trusted teacher. A technician mentioned Cebu with the warmth people reserve for places that raised them. These were not boasts. They were anchors. At first, Daniel listened with professional distance. He had seen many countries praised by their own people. Patriotism was common. What unsettled him was the consistency. Different Filipinos, different roles, different backgrounds, yet the same calm conviction threaded through their words. They spoke of hospitals where resources were limited, but compassion was not. Of universities where professors stayed late to mentor struggling students, of churches that doubled as shelters, classrooms, and places of healing. Daniel found himself leaning in, not to verify facts, but to understand a feeling. One afternoon, during a particularly long day, Daniel sat with a Filipino doctor during a short break. The man spoke quietly about his early training in Manila, about nights when power outages forced them to work by flashlight, about learning to listen before acting. He said something that stayed with Daniel long after the conversation ended. "We were taught that skill means nothing if the patient feels alone." That sentence struck deeper than Daniel expected. He thought of the hospitals he had evaluated in wealthier nations, places filled with advanced machines and brilliant specialists, yet haunted by emotional distance. He remembered patients who felt invisible despite being surrounded by care. And suddenly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The Philippines began to take shape in Daniel's mind, not as a destination, but as a presence already woven into Tehran through its people. He realized that what he was witnessing here was not adaptation, it was extension. The same values carried across borders, unchanged by language or politics. One evening, Daniel was invited to a small gathering in a shared apartment. It was nothing formal, just food, conversation, and a short prayer before the meal. There were nurses, caregivers, and one university student completing research abroad. They spoke about home with reverence, not nostalgia, about faith practiced quietly, about families that endured separation with patience, about a national habit of finding joy even when circumstances offered none. As Daniel listened, he felt a subtle but profound shift inside himself. The skepticism that had once protected him now felt like a barrier. He realized that his despair had not come from seeing too much suffering, but from seeing it without meaning. And here, in these ordinary conversations, meaning was present. Days later, Daniel reviewed patient outcomes and staff evaluations. The numbers confirmed what his heart had already begun to accept. Units staffed heavily by Filipinos reported higher patient satisfaction, lower conflict, and stronger teamwork. It was not perfection. There were mistakes, there was fatigue, but there was also trust. For the first time in years, Daniel felt hope without embarrassment. Not the loud, naive kind, but the quiet kind that withstands reality. He began to understand that the kindness he had witnessed in Tehran was not an exception. It was evidence. Late one night, as Daniel walked alone through the hospital courtyard, he imagined what it would be like to see the Philippines for himself, to walk its streets, to sit in its classrooms, to understand how a nation shaped by storms, poverty, and history could produce people who carried steadiness into the world's hardest places. He did not yet know how deeply this discovery would change him. He only knew that something essential had been restored. The belief that humanity could still surprise him, and that somewhere across the sea, a country he had once barely considered was quietly teaching the world what resilience with compassion truly looks like. What happened next was not dramatic in the way stories are usually told. There was no single announcement, no sudden decision that changed everything overnight. Instead, Daniel found himself slowly crossing an invisible line. The observer became a participant. The evaluator became a witness. And without realizing it at first, he began to lean into the very thing he had spent years keeping at a distance. He started staying longer in the wards, not because his job required it, but because he wanted to understand what he was seeing. He noticed how Filipinos worked together without hierarchy becoming a barrier. Senior nurses listened to juniors. Doctors explained decisions patiently. When mistakes happened, there was correction, but rarely humiliation. Accountability existed, yet it was wrapped in dignity. In quiet moments, Daniel asked deeper questions, not about protocols, but about motivation. Why keep giving when there was so little recognition? Why remain gentle in a place shaped by tension? The answers were simple, almost disarming. One caregiver said, "This is how we were raised." Another said, "We believe suffering does not excuse cruelty." A third simply said, "God sees." Those words stayed with Daniel long after the conversations ended. He began to understand that this kindness was not optimism. It was discipline. It was practiced daily, reinforced by faith, family, and history. Many of these men and women came from hardship themselves. They spoke openly about growing up with limited resources, about storms that destroyed homes, about choosing which bills to pay and which meals to skip. Yet none spoke with bitterness. Hardship had not hollowed them out. It had shaped them. Daniel was invited more often into their shared spaces, small apartments, borrowed rooms, places where laughter came easily and prayer came naturally. Before meals, there was always a moment of gratitude. Not loud, not performative, just acknowledgement. In those moments, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. Stillness. The kind that settles inside you when you stop resisting reality and begin to accept it. One night, during a particularly tense period in the city, a power outage disrupted part of the hospital. Generators kicked in, but the atmosphere grew anxious. Daniel watched as Filipino staff moved instinctively, calming patients, holding hands, explaining gently. Someone began humming a hymn under their breath. The sound was barely audible, yet it changed the room. Fear softened. People breathed again. That was the moment Daniel felt it fully, not admiration, transformation. He realized that for years he had equated strength with control, with systems that eliminated uncertainty. What he was seeing now was a different kind of strength, one that accepted uncertainty and chose compassion anyway, one that did not need ideal conditions to function. Later, alone with his thoughts, Daniel admitted something he had never said aloud before. He had grown tired of a world that measured success, but forgot meaning. And here, through these Filipinos, meaning had returned. He thought of the Philippines not as a place on a map, but as a source. A well that kept giving even when drawn from repeatedly. A nation that had learned, through faith and fracture, how to hold joy and sorrow in the same hands. When a colleague asked him what stood out most about his time in Tehran, Daniel answered without hesitation. "I have never seen this anywhere else, not because the Filipinos were perfect, but because they were present, fully, faithfully, human." That night, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, Daniel felt something shift permanently. The doubt that once defined him loosened its grip. In its place was belief. Not naive belief, but grounded belief. Belief that humanity had not lost its way. Belief that kindness could endure anywhere. Belief that through the quiet resilience of Filipinos, the world was being reminded of what it meant to truly care. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel did not feel like a visitor passing through suffering. He felt connected to something larger, something lasting. Daniel left Tehran quietly, the same way he had arrived. No farewell ceremony, no dramatic conclusion. Just a suitcase that felt heavier than before, not with belongings, but with understanding. On the flight out, as the city disappeared beneath the clouds, he realized something unexpected. He was not relieved to be leaving. He was grateful for what had been revealed to him there. For years, Daniel had believed that survival was the highest achievement people could hope for in difficult places. Endure, adapt, move on. But what the Filipinos in Tehran had shown him was something far deeper. They had not only survived, they had preserved their humanity. They had carried it gently into a place where humanity often arrived bruised and guarded. Back home, colleagues asked him about infrastructure, staffing, logistics. He answered those questions carefully, professionally. But when conversations turned quiet, when someone asked him what truly stayed with him, Daniel always returned to the same truth. The Philippines did not just send workers abroad. It sent values, faith that did not demand comfort, kindness that did not wait for permission, resilience that did not harden the heart. He began to speak differently about the world, less cynically, less defensively. In lectures and meetings, he shared stories instead of statistics. He spoke of nurses who prayed softly beside strangers, of caregivers who carried joy into exhaustion, of a people shaped by storms who had learned how to stand without losing tenderness. Without naming it directly, he challenged the old assumptions he himself had once carried. Daniel realized that the Filipinos he met had restored something in him that data never could. A reason to believe again, not in perfection, but in purpose. They reminded him that systems exist to serve people, not replace compassion. That faith, when lived quietly, can steady entire rooms. That kindness is not weakness, but discipline practiced over a lifetime. What began as one man's discovery became something larger. A quiet message that traveled beyond Tehran, beyond Daniel. In a world fractured by ideology, exhausted by conflict, and numbed by repetition, the example of Filipinos stood as gentle resistance. Proof that dignity can survive pressure, that joy can coexist with sacrifice, that service, when rooted in faith and family, can cross borders without losing its soul. Daniel often thought of the Philippines late at night, not as a distant nation, but as a heartbeat felt across oceans, a place that did not need to announce its strength because it lived it daily. A people who did not ask to be admired, yet earned it through consistency. For Filipinos watching this story, there is something important to remember. The world may not always say it out loud, but it sees you. In hospitals, in homes, in unfamiliar cities, your presence changes the atmosphere. Your faith steadies fear. Your kindness restores balance. You carry your homeland with you, not in flags or slogans, but in how you treat the vulnerable. And for those outside the Philippines, this story offers an invitation to look again, to listen more closely, to question the easy assumptions passed down as truth. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come not from power or wealth, but from people who choose compassion when no one is watching. Daniel never claimed the Philippines saved him. He would say something quieter, something truer. The Philippines reminded him how to live. In a time when the world feels loud, divided, and uncertain, That reminder matters more than ever. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Filipino kindness, discovered not in comfort, but in Tehran. Not shouted to the world, but lived patiently until someone finally paid attention.